Hi everyone, my name is Chris Coppell and I'm with Nilfisk University. I'd like to welcome you all to this training course. The main focus of this course is really twofold. One is to train service technicians how to properly set and maintain adjustments on advanced industrial equipment. The second purpose is to show salespeople the importance of making sure that the machine is working properly before demonstrating, and that usually includes making a number of key settings and adjustments on the products before you start. So here's a list of the things that we hope that you're going to learn as a result of going through this course. The first area that we'd like to start is on how to properly adjust, maintain, and test a squeegee assembly on an advanced industrial scrubber. The second area we're going to focus on is the area of splash skirts, how to properly set them, how to maintain them, and how to test for their proper operation. The third, and perhaps the most important area, is how to operate the machine to make sure that it's doing all of its scrubbing functions properly, not only in a demonstration environment, but also for technical service representatives who have to make sure that after the machine has been fixed, it's working properly and that their customers are going to be pleased with its performance. So let's get started. So this is the squeegee assembly of one of our more popular machines, the Condor. First, let's just take a look at the proper removal technique for the squeegee assembly. Remove the vacuum hose, get it out of the way, and then take and loosen up these hand-tightened knobs. You don't have to loosen them very far in order to get the assembly to pull off the squeegee weldment bracket. From here, we'll take a closer look at what constitutes the construction of this entire squeegee assembly. Let's talk a little bit about the squeegee assembly and its fundamental components. First is the actual squeegee casting. This is the metallic piece that all of the other parts, such as the retainer band and the front and rear squeegee, is attached. Here you see the inner squeegee blade, which is mounted to the front of the squeegee, and the retainer band that holds that actual squeegee to the squeegee assembly. I saved the rear blade and its assembly and left that intact to show you how the rear blade, perhaps the most important blade on the squeegee assembly, is accessed and serviced. First, there's a low pressure clamp assembly here that pinches open, and once it's released, it unlatches, and that band assembly snaps off. From here, you have immediate access to the squeegee blade, and from this position, you can implement a couple of very important service aspects of this assembly. First, as the blade wears, you can rotate the blade left to right in order to utilize the two usable edges on each side. As that second side begins to round or wear, you can take and flip the blade over end for end, and now you have two new serviceable blades. Now, to reinstall the squeegee assembly, once it's been rotated or replaced, simply hook the squeegee blade to the far end, seat the blade through these prongs, and then reattach the retainer band, like so. Retighten, and then your system is ready to go. Using a similar process, you'll take and you will reseat the squeegee for the inner squeegee blade in this portion of the squeegee assembly. Let's take a look at a similar squeegee assembly, but in this case, the blades have been either worn or they've been torn. The inner blade is typically going to receive wear not only along the lead edges, but on the far right and left tip. And these ends of the blade will get worn down or perforated. And once that happens, that compromises the vacuumization integrity of the squeegee, and you lose efficiency. The squeegee blade no longer picks up water the way it's supposed to. So that's when it becomes necessary for this blade to be rotated. Now on this particular blade, typically you can only flip the blade over. It doesn't typically allow you to work end for end in terms of having four usable edges. Once that's rotated or replaced, it's time to take a look at the condition of the main blade, which is the rear blade. And you can see here that portions of this blade have been torn both on the top and on the bottom. Likewise, this blade has already been rotated because of a tear on the far left tip. But what will happen here now is as the blade negotiates itself to the floor, there's a break in the vacuum, and that'll cause vacuum pressure loss here in the squeegee casting, and that'll reduce the water pickup. So that's why it's vitally important that blades are checked on a regular basis for tears and perforation, rotated or replaced as needed, so that the squeegee assembly will pick up water properly. Because at the end of the day, that's how the squeegee is going to work in order to provide the customer with a truly clean, dry, and safe floor surface. Lastly, you're going to want to make sure that you check the underside of the squeegee casting. This is the squeegee channel. And by this, you want to check and make sure that dirt doesn't start to build up or deposit inside these beveled channels. And also, periodically check and make sure that this intake opening is clear and not obstructed by debris. And this is very important because with these squeegee designs, these round surfaces are designed to provide a feature called laminar airflow. And what that means is that air begins to move and make turns. The amount of disturbance created by these changes in the direction of air are minimized, which means that the air passes more freely and more efficiently through the intake. And with that, you get better vacuum pressure within the squeegee casting. Any kind of dirt or debris or something that might disturb that smooth airflow will greatly reduce the positive impact of laminar airflow, and your efficiency will drop, and you won't get your floor as clean and dry as you want to, as opposed to a squeegee casting that's clean. Spray it out with water in the janitor's closet, in a deep sink or in a sink, and then let dry, and then reinstall. We're ready now to reinstall the squeegee assembly onto the squeegee bracket. But before we do that, let's take a look at a couple of very important components that we'll be working with in just a few minutes that have to do with the adjustment of the squeegee. First, you'll notice here a turn knob, and this is the adjustment that's going to affect or change the pitch of the squeegee when the squeegee is riding on the floor. And by pitch, I'm essentially talking about how the squeegee rests on the floor once it's dropped down with the squeegee weldment bracket. Pitch backwards, pitch forward. In some industries, this pitch is referred to as camber. The second adjustment, equally important, takes place here with these dial knobs, and they affect the squeegee support casters below the weldment. What this will do is this will either increase or decrease the amount of down pressure that's allowed to bend, or what we refer to as deflect, the squeegee to the floor. And in a minute, we'll talk about just how much deflection and how much pitch the squeegee needs to have in order to work properly. But before we do that, let's go ahead and reinstall the squeegee back onto the weldment bracket. Remember, when you're tying down these hand bolts, make sure that you don't use a tool or put a death grip on them, because you want those just snug tight. So if in the event one of the tips should happen to get caught on a fixture, the squeegee assembly will break away, thus preserving the integrity of the squeegee casting and not breaking the squeegee weldment bracket. There's another important aspect of these tie-down bolts that you need to consider. Periodically, take and make sure that these bolts are lubricated with lithium grease so that they don't seize up. Over time, moisture, chemicals, and the environment will cause these bolts to sometime get seized up or tightened onto these threads, and they become virtually impossible to remove without using a tool or some kind of wrench. And when you get to that point, you can break the top of these tie-down knobs. So lubricate them periodically, once again, with a lithium grease, and make sure that they're turning easily and freely so that they're easy to untighten when you go through the installation and reinstallation of the squeegee assembly. Well, the next sequence in this training is to talk about how to properly adjust a squeegee assembly on an advanced industrial scrubber. This is perhaps the most important thing that you can learn, because if the machine isn't properly picking up water, it doesn't matter how good the machine scrubs, doesn't matter how good the brushes are, doesn't matter how effective the chemical is, the floor isn't clean, dry, and safe when you're done, and that's what your customer paid their hard-earned money for when they bought the machine. So to start the adjustment process, the first thing that you'll need to do is get in the machine, turn it on, and drop the squeegee assembly to the floor. One of the things that you're going to find out as soon as you get off the machine after dropping the squeegee to the floor is that because of the safety interface on the machine, the squeegee assembly will be lifted right back up off the floor. So to prevent that from happening, before you get off the machine and out of the seat, you'll need to take and utilize the emergency disconnect here of the battery connectors, like so. And once you've disconnected the power, the squeegee blade will remain on the floor. Now that we have the squeegee assembly seated on the floor, let's make an assessment of what the setting is currently. If you look to the far right side of the squeegee, you'll notice that the squeegee blade is fairly bent or deflected to the floor, about 45 degrees, and that's just about right for this squeegee assembly. But as you begin to follow the curve or the circumference of this blade towards the center, you'll notice that the amount of deflection begins to get less and less until we get to the right side of the blade and there's no deflection at all. So right now, if we were to take this machine and start scrubbing the floor, we'd have some water pickup on the right, but we'd have virtually no water recovery to the left of the machine. And therefore, we would have a wet floor and a potentially hazardous floor. So what we need to do first and foremost is we need to straighten out this issue of deflection along the squeegee. And in this case, we start with the down pressure controls here. By simply loosening this jam nut and turning this knob in a counterclockwise direction, it will allow more pressure to rest on this blade, causing it to deflect more deeply onto the floor. Now, once you've made the adjustment, it's going to be important to make the machine go forward so that you can test or you can simulate the setting in a running position. So one of the things you can do is try to nudge the machine forward a little bit, and you'll see that it will start to behave as if it's operating in the scrubbing mode. Yep. The next thing that we're going to start to do is we're going to start to address the pitch of the squeegee assembly, or the camber, and we do that with this knob. This is the adjustment knob for pitch control, and as we take and we turn the knob into the clockwise direction, we begin to increase the pitch forward like so. But as we turn the knob in the counterclockwise direction, you'll notice on the tip assembly that we'll start to raise the tip up off the floor and create more contact or pressure in the center. And now what this will do is even out the setting of the blade. At the end of the day, we want that blade to be perpendicular to the floor at a right angle. And as you begin to push the machine forward a little more, lo and behold, you're starting to get more and more even deflection along the circumference of the blade. After making a couple of fine-tuning adjustments with the pitch control and the down pressure controls, you'll see now that we have relatively even blade deflection from one tip of the squeegee assembly all the way to the other. That deflection should be somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees, and what you're seeing here is just about perfect. But the final test is to actually operate the squeegee assembly under vacuumized pressure, because when the vacuum turns on, it will actually suck the assembly down to the floor a little bit. It will increase the deflection, and that will be your true and final setting. And we'll do that in a later section where we actually run the machine and test for systems operation. Because Advanced Industrial offers two different types of scrub decks, cylindrical and disc, the splash skirt or splash squeegee setups are different for each. Now this particular model that we're working with is the Condor Cylindrical. The first thing to note is that these side skirt assemblies are removable simply by loosening up the adjustment knobs, which are located underneath these bracket assemblies. You can now take and pull the entire skirt assembly from the machine. From this vantage, you get a much better look at how the adjustment mechanism is configured for the cylindrical decks. This turn knob assembly here, as you raise it up, will raise the relative positioning of the blade up off the floor or make it come higher off the floor for less contact. Once that setting is established, you can lock the setting in place with this jam nut knob here. And the same is true for this assembly here. So to start the process, we'll first reinstall the side skirt. Once the side skirt is installed, take and just make a casual assessment of the distance from the lead edge of the blade to the floor so that those settings are relatively even. In other words, the amount of distance to the floor from this side of the skirt to this side is about the same. And one of the things you'll notice is that this skirt right now is just a little bit lower on this side. So I'm going to take and raise the elevation of the skirt by turning this knob in a counterclockwise direction. Once that's done, I'll use these lockdown or jam nuts to secure the setting. Now to test the relative setting of the splash skirt to the floor, I'm going to need to get back on the machine, turn it on, and drop the deck assembly to the floor, traverse forward several feet, and watch and see how this blade unfurrows onto the floor. Okay, so now we're going to engage the scrub deck to the floor. I'm also going to disengage the squeegee and the vacuum system because at this time we don't actually need to pick up any water. Now, I'm going to press on the foot accelerator and move forward, and we're going to watch the behavior of that skirt as it contacts the floor. From this vantage point, you're going to notice that there's only a little bit of deflection over here, about 20 to 30 degrees, but quite a bit of deflection on the blade towards its rear, probably about 45 to 50. One thing to note, for side skirts, or the splash squeegees, you do not require the same amount of blade contact or deflection to the floor that you do on the rear squeegee. It requires just moderate contact in order for it to do its job. So the next thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up the jam nut, and I'm going to raise that assembly just a few millimeters up off the floor to reduce the amount of blade contact. And then from there, I'm going to reinitialize the system, and then we'll run the machine forward again and test the final setting. Now you'll see that the amount of blade deflection from the forward tip of the splash skirt all the way along to its backside is just about even. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of a deflection along the floor is all it needs to properly contain the water and also to properly squeegee the water back into the path of the main squeegee. Once it's set, lock down the setting, and you're good to go. Once you've completed the adjustment setting for the right side splash skirt squeegee skirt assembly, you'll want to go to the opposite side of the machine, to the machine's left side, and perform the same adjustment. Another thing that's important to check before you get ready to run the machine and test it for proper operation is to see whether or not you have a brush installed into the scrub deck assembly, and then to make sure you have the right kind of brush. So to do that, we're simply going to remove the skirt, and then we're going to pull the brush out of the brush housing. In the case of a cylindrical deck, we're going to remove the cylindrical brush, of which there are two, by first removing the idler cap here, and then sliding the cylindrical brush out of the brush cavity. Now, in the case of most machines, the brushes are equipped with what we call a mid-grit 180 brush. And for general purpose industrial applications, this is the correct brush and brush fiber type to be used. But there may be situations where you're operating on a very smooth decorative type floor surface or a freshly coated concrete floor such as an aircraft hangar, and you may require a softer brush so as to not scratch the floor. In more severe environments, you may have a floor that's very old, broken up, pitted and spalded, in which case you want to have a more aggressive fiber like our 40 grit brush, which will give you a much more aggressive scouring power and better cleaning. But in any case, you always want to make sure that you have the right brush for the application and that a brush is installed in the brush cavity before you begin to run the machine. To properly install a cylindrical brush into a cylindrical deck, simply slide the brush forward, press down slightly so that the receiving end of the core mounts to the drive hub. Next, you want to make sure that these two keyways are aligned with the cutouts on this end of the core of the brush. And once those are seated, you can simply raise this assembly, lock, and then tighten. Once the cylindrical brush has been reinstalled, we can take and we can reinstall the splash skirt. One last check is to make sure that the vacuum connection between the squeegee assembly and the recovery tank is intact. To do that, check and make sure that the hose cuff is properly seated and installed inside of the recovery tank. Secondly, make sure that the hose cuff is properly mounted to and securely mounted to the squeegee assembly. Lastly, make sure that the solution tank top seats properly to the tank so that you have proper vacuum seal. What can happen here is that these gasket assemblies can lose their resiliency. They can begin to crack, they can tear, they can break. And when that happens, you lose vacuum pressure between the lid and the tank. So check for wear, replace as necessary, and again, make sure that this gasket seats properly along the entire perimeter of the recovery tank, like so. The next step now is to go ahead and get ready and run the machine in a scrubbing operation so that we can test the scrubbing and pickup performance of the squeegees and the side skirts. To do this, we're going to initialize the machine, and then we're going to go ahead and engage the scrub deck to the floor. We'll start with moderate pressure, and then with regard to the actual solution flow, we'll go ahead and increase solution flow to a number 2 setting, because we want to make sure that we have adequate hydration or water on the floor to really test whether or not the squeegee and the side skirts are working properly. And as you can see, it shows 2 bars now on the solution icon. Likewise, we're at standard setting, the initial setting for the pressure of the cylindrical deck. We're now ready to go ahead and run the machine and take a look and see how well it's going to control solution and pick up water. The next step will be for us to engage the machine into a double scrub. So what we'll do here now is we'll drop the deck to the floor, we'll raise the squeegee, turn off the vacuum, and lay down a fairly large amount of water on the floor. Then we'll come back with the squeegee down, pick up the water, and test and see how well the squeegee picks up large amounts of liquid when it encounters it in a more extreme situation. Now what we're going to do is, with the deck remaining on the floor, we're going to engage the squeegee. I'm going to turn off the water, and I'm going to make a pass up the middle and check and see how well I was able to pick up the solution. This is the scrub deck assembly on the Aggressor disc scrub deck, and it has a unique side skirt assembly. So let's take a few minutes and talk about how we properly adjust this one. Much like what you saw on the cylindrical brush system, there are set jam nuts or tie down knob that takes and allows you to remove the side skirt. Now below these are the actual adjustment mechanisms for the skirt. And as you can see, as I begin to spin this assembly in the counterclockwise position, it will take and it will raise the orientation of the skirt. Likewise, if I turn this in a counterclockwise direction, it'll lower the orientation of the skirt. So what we're looking to do is have a skirt so that when it is seated to the floor, it creates just a mild amount of deflection, blade deflection, so that it will take and it will capture any overspray created by the brushes or the pad driver assembly, and also effectively squeegee the solution or the slurry back towards the center of the machine so that the main squeegee can pick it up. Once you've finished your initial adjustment on this type of a side skirt, it's time to get on the machine, put the machine into scrub mode, and move forward a few feet and see how the skirt assembly is going to react to the floor. So let's go ahead and do that now. To start this testing sequence, we're going to turn the key on and initialize the control console. We're going to take and we're going to push the button down arrow and engage the deck into its primary setting to the floor. Once the deck is seated to the floor, I'm going to go forward with the machine and watch that blade unfold to see what the relative setting is. Now that we've got the deck seated to the floor and the skirts unfolded a little bit, you can see that we have nice deflection along the floor, but most importantly, the amount of contact that we have is pretty much even from one side of the skirt all the way to the back. And that will ensure two things. Number one, it'll capture any overspray that's created by the disc brushes or the pad drivers when they're operating on the floor. And number two, it ensures that you get proper channeling of the solution or the cleaning slurry back to the squeegee so that the rear squeegee picks it up correctly. This is a splash skirt assembly which we've removed off the aggressor, and we'll take a look at some of the maintenance procedures required to make sure that these skirts stay intact and what needs to be done when it's time to rotate or replace them. First of all, as an older model machine, the fasteners and the hardware used to fasten the retaining band to the actual casting will require a tool. So once we break free these nuts, you'll notice that there's a primary support blade, and that backs the actual blade that contacts the floor on the skirt here. Now, these blades can be rotated once they become worn or torn, and they can be flipped end for end. So there are essentially 4 usable edges on these blades. This blade does not receive a lot of wear compared to this blade, so typically this blade will outlast and outwear the primary blade, and likewise these can be rotated or flipped end for end so that there are 4 usable edges on this blade. Once they've been reseated and the blades have been checked to make sure that they're seated properly in the channel, they're ready for reinstallation. Here we have the squeegee assembly that we removed off the cylindrical deck of the Condor. And let's talk a little bit about the maintenance and the care procedures for this assembly. As this blade, single blade, begins to wear, or if it gets torn or perforated, it's easy to take and to use these hand-tightened fasteners to loosen them up, and then to remove these contact pins so that the retainer band pops off. And there are a total of 3 of these hand-tightened fasteners. And once they're loosened up and the entire band is removed, you can easily take and you can rotate this blade assembly as there are 4 usable edges. And then to reseat the assembly, just simply repress this fitting back into position and then tighten up like so. And now the splash skirt assembly is ready for reinstallation. We've been working with 2 specific advanced model scrubbing machines, the Aggressor and the Condor. But because we make a number of different models, the side skirt assembly and the squeegee assembly setups are a little bit different, and how you go about adjusting them differ from one to the other. So if you want to find out what the exact procedures are for each of these other machines, I would advise you to go ahead and check your operator's manual for that information. Before we get ready to run the machine and test for proper operation, it's always important to check and make sure that brushes or pad drivers are mounted to the machine and to make sure that you've got the right scrubbing medium. So I'll remove the splash skirt and check to make sure that I have a brush or a pad driver. In this case, we're working with 180 midlight grit brushes. And I want to make sure that the brushes have enough trim or fiber and that they're not worn down to a point where they need to be replaced. Once I know that I've got a brush mounted correctly to the machine and I have the proper brush, I'm ready to button the machine back up and get ready to scrub. One last thing that we want to check before we get started scrubbing and testing out the pickup performance of the machine is to check and make sure that all of the hoses are properly connected and that the top of the recovery tank is seated properly. So first, let's check and make sure that this hose cuff is mounted tightly to the squeegee assembly. Next, let's make sure that the drop recovery drain hose and its cap is properly tightened and seated. And then lastly, you'll want to make sure that this gasket is intact and that it's properly seating to the top of the recovery tank. This will ensure that you get maximum vacuum pressure and maximum water pickup down at the squeegee. If for any reason this gasket should become perforated or cut or lose its resiliency, it should be pulled out and replaced. Replacement is easy because it's a captured gasket system and it just simply seats in like so. Operate the machine now in the scrub mode and to test the squeegee and the side skirts for proper performance. To do that, let's talk about the proper settings. First, we'll turn the key on and initialize the control panel. Next, we'll engage the deck into the primary down pressure setting. The solution flow will automatically default. From here, I'm going to simply press down on the accelerator and in a single pass mode, check for scrubbing and water pickup performance. In this next sequence, we're going to put the machine into a double scrub mode of operation. To do this, I'm going to engage the scrub deck to the floor. I'm going to raise the squeegee off the floor and turn off the vacuum. And I'm going to pass along the floor and apply a coat of solution. Then I'm going to come back and engage the squeegee, make a pass up the middle, and pick up all of the slurry. This is a good test because it shows how well the squeegee will recover water under adverse circumstances. Well, as you can see, as a result of our work, the floor is absolutely dry, absolutely clean, and absolutely safe. And when it comes to settings and adjustments, that's exactly what we're looking for. We want to make sure that the customer's product is working perfectly because that's what they paid their hard-earned money for. So that just about concludes the session for today. I appreciate your time. Chris Coppell with Nilfisk-U. Good having you here.